I say welcome to our session. This is going to be Gina Simm, who's talking about to matter and belong. For over 30 years, Gina has been teaching in early childhood education. Most significantly, her knowledge of nonviolent communication has transformed her classroom into a place where systems of the heart create a child-centered environment for moving through conflict. She was asked to write a book about her systems for staying connected and has recently published Heart to Heart. Gina lives in the Pioneer Valley co-housing community in Amherst, Massachusetts, where she is the leader of the Care and Counsel Circle. Please welcome Gina, and I'll turn it over to you. I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me and see me? Good. So I am going to be using a PowerPoint, and I'm going to pull that up now, and hopefully we can see the slides and each other at the same time. And share screen. Here we go. Look at that. It worked. Does that make sense, Pat?
Yes.
Visually?
Looks great. Looks great.
And I can only see 4 people, including myself, but I guess that's okay.
So I can see everybody here. So if anybody wants to have questions, you can put it in the chat, and I'll keep track of that.
All right, so shall I begin?
Please.
All right, great. So to matter and belong is kind of what brings us to co-housing in the first place, I believe. I think, we have this vision of something I tried to capture in this picture. This is actually a photo that Mary Krause took that I found online, and I even tried to take my own pictures and then ended up coming back to this because it includes, the houses, it includes the path, and it includes the cart, which is sort of the practical reality of co-housing in our community. This is Pioneer Valley. And it gives you, or I guess gives me the feeling of belonging to something. And, whether you're living in a co-housing community already, or if you're planning to, and you're sort of envisioning this feeling that I'm trying to capture here, it's about, feeling known. And, I look at this picture and I can just go into so many different positive feelings in my mind because the images represent people and experiences and conversations and, all kinds of, things. So this is my home and this is where I belong and I matter because I'm known. So I remember, hearing about co-housing for the first time, and in my mind, I pictured a village. And I say this a lot when people ask me, what is co-housing? And the village idea is that you have these little homes that are clustered together, and you have all different kinds of characters in the village. So you have the village grouch, and you have the village gossip, and the village therapist, and the doctor, and the list goes on. So there are people that we gravitate towards, and there's people that we don't. So some of these people can be your friends, and some of these people you might not like, but you consider them part of the love of the community. So that's what this is all about. I'm going to go to the next slide. And the idea here is that the mattering and belonging is so significant that when that need gets jeopardized, there's the potential for conflict. And so with this slide, I tried to kind of represent, you know, sort of the common mattering and belonging voices that come out in conflict that we've had over time. And I've witnessed a lot of this conflict because of being part of Care and Counsel, which is the name of our committee that keeps our finger on the pulse of the emotions of the community, the social emotional aspect of things. And because, you know, I've been teaching first grade for so many years, I have a lot of different ways of representing images with speech bubbles. So the first one is an angry image, you know, nobody ever listens to me. And this is a very common voice for conflict. And I think often, you know, you'll have somebody in your community that's just feels that way their whole entire living experience in community. And if you move over to the right, you know, what happened to the co and co-housing, that's kind of a dismayed voice. It's not exactly angry, it's a little just kind of dismayed, disheartened, you know, discontent. And that's also, you know, sort of like, okay, why is this happening? So I guess I don't really matter. And then down at the left, we have another angry voice. I never wanted to live here in the first place. And you may have people in your communities that didn't sign up for co-housing. They ended up here. But they didn't, they weren't part of the original membership. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So when those people don't feel like they matter and belong, it's significant because it has a different kind of significance because they go back to that original, you know, narrative in their mind of, I never wanted to live here in the first place. And the last one is a sad face. And this is the sort of the self-critic, you know, I guess, you know, I don't belong here. I guess this place isn't for me. You know, I don't know how to communicate. I get into these problems all the time. I guess, you know, I don't matter to myself, so therefore I don't matter to others. So these are the kinds of voices that I'm trying to represent in making the point that mattering and belonging is really what's underneath conflict. All right, so I tested this whole thing yesterday, timed it and everything, and I'm offering after this slide before we move to the next one, if you have any questions or any comments that you want to make. So we can, if you want to handle that, Pat.
I don't see any hands raised. Nothing in the chat.
Okay.
Continue.
All right, so we'll continue on. All right, so this is the slide that have a bunch of little principles or mind frames, I guess is a good way to think about it, when there is conflict, whether you're in conflict or you're hearing about it. And this has been my new mantra, the first bullet here, which is conflict is natural. I've been saying that a lot to myself when it happens. And there's been a bit of conflict, I'd say a lot of conflict, more conflict recently since the pandemic in our community than before. And it has to do with a little group that we formed called the COVID-19 Prep Group. And it's a group that is trying to really pay very close attention to the research and to inform people or make recommendations to the community about how to stay safe. And so you can imagine that, you know, there's people that you know, are challenging that. And a lot of work has gone into this, you know, a lot on the part of the individuals in this group, meeting very frequently and doing things, you know, outside of meetings, etc. So that's where my new mantra came in. Just for myself, because, you know, Care and Counsel has been called for various mediations, and also just talking to each other about this, because you can get into a place easily when there is conflict of just getting mad about it. Like, why do we, you know, your brain is saying, why do we have to have this happening, you know? But if you have the frame of conflict is natural and therefore expect it, I think you create a space for more effectiveness. The next thing to remember is that feelings come and feelings go, and that is just true. So, you know, this is one of the lessons I have in the book that I wrote, which has a curriculum in it for kids. And the first lesson is feelings come and feelings go. And we've talked about that as a class many times, you know, especially if somebody's upset, you know, someone will say feelings come and feelings go. And we've had discussions about how impossible it is to sustain feelings, even positive feelings, you know, of course you would love for those to stay. But anything, even like, you know, a death of a family member and the devastation of feelings that are that strong, you know, after a while, you know, your body has to release. So that's another thing to keep in mind in conflict. The other thing is very significant, the third bullet. This is like an NVC principle, nonviolent communication, and that is we can live with unmet needs. So when you first hear about NVC, you'll hear about you know, the feelings, and underneath the feelings are the needs. So if I feel nervous, I might have a need for ease, as an example of the two things going together, feelings and needs. And when we hear about these, you know, needs, and they're so awesome and they're universal and NVC is so cool, I think what our underlying belief is that we have to get these needs met. You know, we have to have our own needs met, and we have to meet other people's needs. And I remember the first time I grappled with this concept as a teacher, actually, another teacher and I were becoming NVC informed, and we were getting very excited about it. And he said to me, I remember one day, I remember exactly where I was standing and everything in this conversation. He said to me, so I guess we have, you know, we are really responsible as teachers for meeting all of our students' needs. And I was like, I don't think so. And then I think he said something like, well, definitely, you know, the academic needs. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Well, and so it was an interesting discussion, and basically the idea is that we can't really meet other people's needs. People can only meet their own needs. Just because we have a need, it doesn't mean it needs to get met. So I think this is another good principle to keep in mind when conflict happens, because if you really do have this expectation of need meeting, 100% of need meeting, in conflict, you are going to, that's gonna take you down the road of ineffectiveness. Next principle, there are ways to move forward. And you know, that's what I'm leading up to for this presentation. I have created a document that we've used in our community for giving and receiving feedback. So I'm going to be talking about that and going over that with you. And it's been a very good tool for us, and we've used it in a lot of different ways. So that's an example of there are ways to move forward. And then the last is empathy is our best friend, because if you really have an understanding of empathy, and it's not that simple, actually, you you're going to have much more ease in giving and receiving feedback. So those are the two forms that I'm sharing with you, or maybe they've already been shared because I did submit them for sharing. So there's the first form, which I'm going to go over next, is what empathy is and what empathy is not. And then the second form is the feedback form. The community feedback form is what it's called. Any questions on this slide?
Well, question just in general, will the slides be available as pictures?
The slides?
Yes.
Will the slides be available for participants, are you saying?
Yes.
Oh, sure, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions before I move to the next slide? So let's learn about empathy. And this is a chart that is, I refer to as a living document. In other words, it's gone through many renditions. It's got a lot of flexibility, and I just added some things recently from learning about a person who's doing a lot of empathy work in connection to neuroscience. Her name is Sarah Payton, if you're interested. All right, so we have the left-hand side, which is the things to keep in mind if you want to stay on the empathy path. And the right-hand side are things that are sort of little red flags for getting off of the empathy path. But the most important thing to say about the right-hand side is that there is absolutely nothing wrong with any of the things on that side. It's just not empathy. So that's very important to remember, because so much of the time when we're trying to help somebody and be there for them, we do things on the right-hand side, but and they're effective, but they're not empathy. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask. And you can raise your hand throughout any of the presentation on this form. You don't have to wait until the end. I'm going to go through these now. All right, so the first thing, understanding is biggie. You know, you're basically trying, when you are in the position of giving empathy to somebody, being there for somebody that is in distress, and getting back to conflict. If you are in conflict with somebody and in your mind, you're trying to put yourself in their shoes. So therefore you're aiming for an empathic frame in your own mind. The basic point is trying to understand them. Now, I emphasize the word trying because it really is more important than the actual understanding. And that's what I think the receiver wants. They want you to be trying to understand what it is like to be them in this situation. So the whole idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes comes from that when people talk about what empathy is. On the right-hand side, opposing the word understanding is the word fixing, because that is a very big tendency. We really go there. And I think one of the reasons why we go there is because it gives us something to do. And it's when you're just trying to understand somebody, you're not really doing anything. And you're not really saying anything. You're just kind of sitting there. And it can feel uncomfortable because you're not offering anything that's tangible, that's physical, that's, you know, either saying something or doing something. So I think that's why we tend to go into the fixing energy. But and again, you know, the whole, you know, another way to talk about this as another term is problem solving. Even though problem solving can be a big relief for somebody, it's not empathy. So the next thing, staying with the present. So staying with the present, if you go down a little further, two bullets down, a quality of presence, that's a little different. Staying with the present is talking about not going into the past and not going into the future, just staying with the present in your own mind when you're listening. A quality of presence is different. So staying with the present versus analyzing, you know, we tend to analyze by thinking about, wow, like, even if you're thinking and you're not actually saying it, like if somebody's telling you, you know, how hard it is to, how hard it is to accept the fact that you're late, that they're late all the time. And you're saying to yourself, wow, I wonder how long this has been going on. Like this is, oh yeah, I remember that time, you know, you were late 5 days in a row. You know, you're leaving the present. Or going into the future, like, wow, this is never going to change, obviously. Or I wonder if I should say something about, you know, what they can do to help themselves. You know, all of this is analyzing, can go into fixing energy, but it is not staying with the present time, you know, what's happening right now while this person is talking and you are theoretically listening, even though it's not that simple. That's an oversimplification. The next thing, connection versus content. So always aiming for connection, like keeping the connection going. And, you know, sometimes you lose your connection and you can even say to the person, you know, I'm losing my connection here. And I don't want to, but just want to let you know I'm feeling a little distracted or something like that. You can, it happens, but that is the aim, is to stay connected. Focusing on the content is another tendency that we have when we're listening to somebody. And it tends to make us want to ask questions like, so wait a second, you said that this happened on Monday, but wasn't it really Tuesday that this, you know, like things like that. It's not important. And it's a distraction for the person who's receiving empathy. Just let me know if I'm going a little too fast. Okay, quality of presence. Quality of presence, yeah. So you want to really look and act like you are there. So you're creating a quality of presence. Identifying is another thing that we tend to do, and sometimes that can be helpful. But just beware that it's risky. Those things on the right-hand side are risky ways of helping. So identifying is when you say, oh yes, that happened to me, when my mother died, you know, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, if you're sitting there and you feel like you really want to share something that you think is going to really help them feel supported, you could ask, like, I'm suddenly flashing on my own mother's death, and I'm wondering if it'll help for me to share this with you, something like that. So kind of asking for permission. Next thing, caring attention, just another way of thinking about it. The caring is more important than the actual getting it. I've even found myself saying that to my students, you know, when I was teaching, and this is first grade, you know, and just, I was bombarded with problems every day. And, you know, all I wanted to do was do the math lesson. And I found myself saying a lot like, wow, I really care about this. and I'm going to have to get back to the math lesson. But just while you're paying attention to this math lesson, I want you to know that I'm thinking about you because I really care about what's going on for you. So I use that word a lot. Physically comforting, this is a very controversial thing on the right-hand side. So many people have said, what do you mean? And the reason why it's there is because many people don't want to be physically comforted. Or they might much of the time, but they don't in that moment. So it's again, it's risky. And people like myself would never even say, oh, I really don't want a hug right now. I would just definitely take the hug and feel uncomfortable and never say anything again. So that's why that's there. Listening with whole being is another way to just frame this for yourself. Interrogating is kind of a strong word, but it's there because it might feel that way to the person receiving the empathy. And this is an area that I think I fell into before I started, understanding all this stuff. I noticed that I was a big question asker in supporting people. And it was my own nervousness of, wanting to do something and wanting to have something to say. And I could see, that how it would feel like it was interrogating. Following versus leading, that's kind of self-explanatory. And guessing versus knowing, that's a big one. So once you do start talking, and if you're doing an NVC empathy session, if you have any NVC background, you're guessing, what you're usually guessing are needs behind the person's feelings, because usually that's what they're doing, is they're sharing their feelings. So you would say something like, I'm guessing the reason why this is so stressful is because you weren't expecting it and you just really wanted some predictability. Versus if you're saying that, using that same context, but in a knowing way, you might say something like, well, it's just a totally unpredictable situation. Has a whole different feeling to it. Next one, translating into feelings and needs. So that's an NVC thing, which if you know NVC, that's great, but if you don't, that's fine. But when you're listening to somebody, in your mind, you could be doing that translating for them. You're like, in other words, if the person is kind of barking at you, you could be, as a listener, as an empathy giver, translating what they're saying into their intention. That's very sophisticated, especially if you're in conflict with your partner. That is usually the hardest thing to do, translating in that kind of situation. Educating, obviously, is just basically feels very patronizing and what's the other word? Condescending. And you might not be intending that at all, but it can be received in that way. So like what you really need to think about is, that thing we talked about last week where, just stay focused. That's educating. Being versus doing, that's huge. That's a great frame. The doing energy is what we tend to gravitate towards. And it's all because of, how we grew up and how people handle conflict or handle support. So the These last two are from, like I mentioned, learning about this from this person, Sarah Payton, who is doing a lot of research with empathy and neuroscience. And she uses this word accompanying. And she feels, especially with, she does a lot of work with trauma. So when people feel accompanied, it really supports the effectiveness of empathy. And you could see why the trauma thing, so much trauma is about feeling abandoned. You can see that how that could really hold a lot of effectiveness. And I just threw that word separating in as just as a versus kind of a word. And I don't mean like physically separating, but just sort of not going there with the person. And of course, none of this means that you're giving up your own autonomy at all. It's not like you are actually becoming the person that you are empathizing with. You are imagining what it's like to be them. Very different. So you're not losing yourself. And then the last one is resonating, and this is, I love this this concept because the way Sarah Payton talks about it is, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Did you just say something, Pat?
Gina, do you want to ask, someone has a question?
Oh, somebody has a question. Sure, yeah, love it.
Sure, I'm going to unmute.
This is Mabel.
Yeah,
I was taking notes, so I wasn't looking at the slide at the time, and I was surprised that guessing at the cause of it was a good thing. That so it's like, like, oh, I think you're feeling this way because blah.
Yeah, so you're saying, are you feeling this way because of blah? You're not saying you're feeling this way because of blah.
Okay, and just by turning it into a question, that's okay, because I just sort of had the feeling of saying, no, it's not that at all.
Yes, right. That's actually good. When the person says, when you say, I'm guessing that, it's because you need predictability, and then the receiver says, no, it's actually not predictability, but thank you for pointing that out because it gives me more clarity. What it really is, just ease. And so the guessing, you have to be willing to be wrong when you're guessing. Okay. And so that's kind of understood. Or if it's not understood, it's a good thing to establish, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm thinking on my own part that sometimes the reaction might be, no, that's not it at all, but I can't articulate what it is, and so that it might just be frustrating to have that.
That's perfect. That's exactly what came out of your mouth is a perfect way to respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else before I go to the last two? So resonating, Sarah has these two cellos as her metaphor for resonating. These, for any of you who play string instruments, you'll know what I'm talking about. So you have two cellos in the same room, one being played by a person and one not being played. And the one not being played, if the note is hit in a particular way, the other cello will resonate with that note by actually making a sound. And, it's the theory of harmonics, actually. And that is a really nice metaphor for the whole resonating idea. And then dampening would be the opposite of that, where, if you you mute a string, you're dampening it. So that's it. That is the empathy list. And I'd love to hear from people, you know, even if you don't have any questions, if you have any reactions.
And a question from Marie.
Hi, Gina.
Hey.
So, so when do you use the empathy, and when do you start using maybe some of the things in the other category? You know, are you talking about like your first conversation with somebody, or if you're in your caring council and somebody says I'm having a problem with somebody else in the community, how do you start your session with them? With just the empathetic?
Yes.
Being?
What we've learned in Caring Council, we have this whole menu of options for people that are in conflict. And what we usually start with is what we call a listening ear. And we don't even use the word empathy because the word empathy has its own, I don't know, it's just too formal or something. It's just not as colloquial. So the first thing that we will do, usually I'll get an email, or the whole committee will get an email saying, you know, I'm in this conflict, you know, what should I do? And one of us will respond by saying, well, the first thing we want to do is offer a listening ear. And that is just phrasing it that way, offering a listening ear is usually something that people respond very well to. Just they really warm up to that, like they understand what that is. All they're going to be doing is listening. You know, finally, you know, somebody's going to listen. So we will make an appointment for that. And when you are offering a listening ear, that's what you're doing, is everything on the left-hand side. Especially, you know, in community, you know, you really don't want to be risking anything on the right-hand side. You know, you just, it's too risky. If you're with a friend, on the other hand, the right-hand side can be less risky because you already have a relationship and a lot of trust. So if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Marie?
Yeah, and if the person is having a conflict with another person, then do you invite that second person in for a listening ear?
Yes.
And then are you trying to eventually facilitate some conversation or mediate conversation between the two?
Yeah, then it starts moving into a more formal zone. And that's where we explore our options and we ask if the people who are in conflict want something more than a listening ear. And then we present our options, which, you know, we have all kinds of options like mediation and Byron Katie sheet, and we have things called a clearing. We have a whole bunch of stuff. We have a whole booklet. And, you know, a mediation versus a facilitated conversation. And then we have all the people that are in that committee or circle, in our case, that the people in conflict can choose from. So who would you like to meet with? So that's another really good thing, because giving them choice of who they feel comfortable talking to can go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since we came up with this term, you know, a listening ear, we have had way less moving into the next step. We've had way more response and way less having to go into formal stuff, formal things, you know, like a feedback form or a mediation or whatever.
And it sounds like you're trying to help them understand what need in themselves that they're having issues with. That what this empathy helps them get to, oh, this is why I feel this way. Because first and foremost,
they feel like somebody cares. Secondly, which is also important, but not as important as the first one, they're getting some clarity. And clarity is so helpful, so golden.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
From Ruth Eddy. I'm going to, Ruth Eddy, are you muted? Can I unmute you?
I'm unmuted. My
Okay.
question was, who came up with the expression listening ear? And how long have you been using it?
I don't remember. You know how that works in co-housing, or maybe you don't. Like, you know, you just.
Not yet.
Yeah, you don't. It could have been me, but might not have been. And we just all were like, yeah, that's what we get. We had a very difficult situation. I remember now. We had a member that was really mad at the community, mad at the whole community. And that was big. And that person also was mad at Care and Counsel, you know. They were mad, you know, that person was mad at Care and Counsel, that person was mad at Community Life, which is our next circle that sort of is the mother-parent circle to Community Life and many other things, and Care and Counsel and many other things. So we were just trying to find a way to support that person. So that's how that came about.
It's wonderful. It takes all the charge away. Even a 3-year-old would understand it. I just love it.
Exactly. Oh, good. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's thank you for highlighting that for me, because I didn't even realize until this moment, like, where did that come from? So, and that person that was so mad at the community is not mad at the community anymore. You know, that we had more than one listening ear session with that person, and other things that came together. But just to let you know that, you know, feelings come and feelings go. Ready to move on, Pat?
Actually, I have one question from, I think, Jamie. He's got his hand up there. I see it now. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yes, so I'm not a member of the co-housing community, and I really appreciate the to matter and belong concept. But I'm wondering just how many of these kind of conflicts does your caring counsel deal with? I mean, I understand that in a tighter knit community, there's going to be some tension, some small issues along the way, but I'm just kind of curious as to the order of magnitude of this.
Yes, no, it's great. I hadn't even thought about that, because if you don't have a sense of how this could be, it isn't really good. You might think, wow, we're just busy all the time. We're not really. I think our community is pretty old, and it's had a lot of different renditions of what has come to be Care and Counsel. And before we had dynamic governance, when we were doing things by consensus, we had our little Care and Counsel group, which was then called Community Support, was not as organized, and I don't think as effective or trusted. And but now, since, you know, I don't know how many years we've been doing sociocracy in Pioneer Valley, but since we have gotten ourselves organized, our social emotional life in co-housing has really improved. And but in terms of numbers, so I can tell you, I just did a mediation about a week ago. That was something where a listening ear moved right into a mediation. A mediation is like probably the most formal thing you can do. Let's see, we have offered ourselves in many ways to support what's going on with the virus. So we put out like a little positive news link for people so that they could have something besides the news of the day, you know, on NPR. You know, things like that, working on things like that. And there was a conflict maybe 4 weeks ago where that had nothing to do with the virus. And we did not have to get it up. I didn't answer a call that I got. I got a phone call, I didn't answer it. I texted back later. I called back later, and then he texted me saying, I'm glad you're offering a listening ear, but I think I'm good for now because I got it from so-and-so, who was not even somebody on Care and Counsel. And that whole conflict ended up getting itself addressed, not through Care and Counsel, but through another circle that those two people were in. So, you know, that kind of thing happens too. But that was tough. One of the people left. One of the members left, took off, you know, and lived somewhere else for a couple of weeks. It's not there often, you know, and most things are just handled by our offering to listen. It's very rare that we have to do mediations. In the last year, there's been probably 2 mediations. If that helps with a number idea.
Yeah, it's kind of what you're saying is impressive to me in that it seems that your community is sort of very good empathy students, you know, sort of seems to be part of their DNA now, which is
yes,
which is encouraging for somebody like me, just sort of looking outside.
Gotcha.
Looking for this type of.
Well, we also have a weekly NVC practice group that's been meeting for years. So that's another thing that really helps people become more emotionally intelligent. All right, so are we ready to move on?
I think so.
All right. So, like I was saying before, if we have an understanding of empathy, we can use this tool that I created called the feedback form. And that is coming right up. All right. So sorry I could not make this any bigger, but it's got these little bubbles at the top are just for fun. The meat of this form are these 3 parts. My experience, what I appreciate, and what I was hoping for, and why it matters to me. So the little bubbles are just kind of venues for using the form. I'd like to give feedback to a committee. I'd like to give feedback to a friend. I'd like to give feedback to a neighbor, to someone in my family, to the membership committee, to an individual, to dynamic governance, to Care and Counsel, blah, blah, blah. So those are just, that's just like a fun image to have at the top of the form. So this form is what I usually offer after a listening ear. And what I do with the person, they usually come to my house, you know, I sit down, usually, you know, I'm listening for an hour. And then I say, I'm going to offer this, totally up to you to use it. People in our community have had a lot of success. Other people have said, no, didn't work for me. But mostly it has had it has had effectiveness. I've actually used it. I was in conflict with somebody a couple of years ago, and I was like in panic and thinking, what am I supposed to do? And then I remembered the feedback form, which I actually created. And it gave me so much relief to have something. And I immediately started filling it out. And that's the thing, just filling it out, even before I asked the person if they were open to receiving it, gave me so much clarity and relief. And that's one of the reasons why I offer it. And I say to people that I will sit down with them if they need it, if they need me to help them fill it out. I will accompany them. So I'm going to give you an example of how to fill out this form. But before I do, I'm going to go to what's on the other side of the form, which states some principles of effective feedback. So on the back of the form is what you see here on the screen. Principles of effective feedback. So the first one is engage willingness to receive feedback. So when you do this, you are really softening the conflict right away. Just you're asking if they're willing, and since you are asking, that means the answer can be no. So you're already letting them know that you're willing to accept no for an answer. So this idea of willingness is huge, and it's a big NVC word. So checking to see if the willingness is there, and especially being willing to postpone the offering until the time when the willingness is there, tends to increase the experience of mattering, and thereby is likely to contribute to more openness. Meanwhile, one may request some empathy from a member of care and counsel. So you can, and the other thing is, you fill out this form, with your pencil or online, because this is in our Google Docs. Or you don't have to fill it out at all. You can just fill it out in your mind. You can just have that frame of those 3 parts in your mind. And I like to do things in 3s and no more than 3. Just even these 3 bullet points here, because our brains can't handle more than 3 things. I learned that a long time ago teaching little kids. So that's the first thing, engaging in willingness. The second thing is invite feedback in the other direction. So say, and I would love to get feedback from you about what happened. And this encourages collaboration and self-responsibility. So I'm going to be taking responsibility for my part, and you don't say, and hopefully you are going to be taking responsibility for your part, because that's a trigger and it's none of your business anyway. That's like a Byron Katie phrase, none of your business. So that's the second thing, and that's huge. And then the third thing, use specific and concrete observational language when describing your experience. This is very complicated. And when I give you these examples, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This is not easy to do. Connecting feedback to tangible moments plays a key role in helping the receiver understand and connect with feedback. This applies to both satisfaction and dissatisfaction. So if you can name, like the room we were in, like when I said that thing, or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or it was in the community life meeting that we were having, things like that. Very specific and concrete. All right, I'm going to go backwards now. Oh, can I go backwards? I got to figure out how to do this. I get escape. Yeah, that's what I did. Just hit escape. All right, there we go. All right, so the idea with stating your experience is trying to create a picture of what it was like to be me in the situation so that the other person can understand. So if you want to do that effectively, then you're not going to use triggering language. So you're not going to be using any kind of judgmental language like the word should or the word you. Those are two words to stay away from. In fact, I recommend playing around with just taking those words out of your vocabulary when you're communicating. Just playing around. Sometimes you can't, and that's fine. But just see what it's like. Because when we hear the word you, even if something positive is about to come afterwards, we bristle just because of our paradigm that we live in. And should, same thing. All right, so let me give you an example. This is a conflict that I was in. It doesn't matter, I'm not going to give you too much context, just for privacy reasons. But so this was to an individual. I filled out the form. The person was not willing to receive the feedback, so I filled out the form. And that was fine. I was totally fine with that. But then, and then I also invited feedback in the other direction. And the other person said, yeah, put a feedback form in my mailbox. So I did that. But that person never filled out the form. But this is what I did right. And it really helped me. So for my experience, I wrote, I experienced a tone of sarcasm in 2 circle meetings and the last full circle meeting. Okay, so I experienced the tone of sarcasm. Maybe other people in the room didn't. So I'm taking responsibility for my experience. It was hard for me to translate the sarcasm into the heartfelt intention underneath. I went into a shutdown reaction. So that was it. That's all I wrote from my experience. Any questions? Or comments or? Okay.
No?
All right.
All
What
good.
I appreciate your willingness to speak up when important values are at stake. So this is an example of a dissenting voice. Co-housing, you have to expect dissenting voices in co-housing. And you have to, of course you're going to have a dissenting voice. To even be in co-housing is a dissenting voice. So we're all used to having a dissenting voice before we even get to co-housing. In other words, my dissenting voice is, I refuse to live the way I have been living. I want to live in a different paradigm. So that's a dissenting voice from the paradigm of, the suburbs or whatever. So the reason why I'm bringing up a dissenting voice is because what we don't do well when we dissent is we don't do it respectfully. And the reason why we don't is because we have no models for it. And so people tend to use a dissenting voice with self-righteous indignation. And that is the enemy. If you're taking any notes, a self-righteous indignation tone is the enemy to effective communication. Write that one down. So this is what was happening. This person had a dissenting voice, which was really valuable, but they had too hard of a time dissenting respectfully. And that just completely interfered with the function of our circle. And it's totally understandable. When we're upset about something, we're mad about something and we want to make our voices heard. In other words, what are our values underneath this upsetness? You are putting yourself in the position of having a dissenting voice, which is good because you're going to be expressing your true values. But be careful not to do it disrespectfully. Otherwise, people are going to put their hands over their ears. We cannot hear disrespectful dissent. It's just too hard. So this phrase that we do have it somewhere in our paradigm, I respectfully disagree, that's a great thing, but people don't actually do it. Then they proceed to do it disrespectfully. So that is why I wrote that, what I appreciate, because it's true. Yes.
Question: What was the experience? Could you just repeat what your experience was again?
Oh yes, I'm not. This is something I'm not going to be sharing other than verbally, so you can write it down. I experienced a tone of sarcasm in 2 circle meetings and the last full circle meeting. It was hard for me to translate the sarcasm into the heartfelt intention underneath. I went into a shutdown reaction. And that is what I tend to do. I tend to freeze in the, fight, flight, freeze options. I tend to freeze. That's what I've learned about myself. I mean, I just did it yesterday in a meeting that we had. I was triggered and I froze. And that's what I love about actually sociocracy is the round idea is that you know that somebody's going to ask you, that it's going to be your turn to talk. You don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to, you just know that you're going to have a turn to speak. And that has saved me because I am not going to speak unless somebody asks me. That's how I am. That's what I've learned about myself. Are we ready for what I was hoping for and why it matters to me? Okay.
Yes.
I was hoping for an expression of respectful sincerity with ownership of any judgment. It matters to me that a respectful tone is used with a dissenting voice. Owning judgment is another concept. It's sort of like, it's a nuance about judgment. We all know judgment is difficult. And judgmental language and judgmental tone is difficult. But if we can own our judgments, even to the point of saying, I'm about to say something judgmental. I'm about to express a judgment I have about the situation. That is being self-responsible about your judgment. And as long as you can do it respectfully, which is not easy, then that's a nuance to communication. Okay. The only other thing that I wanted to share was a feedback form that I received. This is a different conflict that I received, and the only part of it that I'm going to share is the appreciation part. And it really meant a lot to me. So I had a conflict with somebody. This is when I said I came home and I was like, oh my God, what should I do? And I filled out my form and I immediately emailed the person and said, you know, are you willing to receive some feedback? And I would love to hear from you in the other direction. And that person emailed me immediately and said, yes, and put a form in my mailbox and just know I'm not going to be able to get back to you for a week because of blah, blah, blah happening in that person's life. It gave me so much relief. I put my feedback form in that person's box. Exactly a week later, I got one back all filled out. It was a lot, like went onto the back side and it's okay. This is like, okay, all right, I get it. I think I know what it's like to be you. We never talked about it. We didn't have to. We still refer to it about how great it was to have the feedback form for that, because we never had to process it in person. And it's built, and it built our relationship actually. You know, not that we were in a bad relationship before that, but it just, we got to know each other better. So what that person wrote for an appreciation for me was they wrote a lot of things, but the main thing that I loved was, I generally just appreciate your many gifts to the community. Even though I knew that already, just seeing it in print like that, you know, in her own handwriting, it just really warmed my heart and just was very moving. And any questions or comments? Or just reactions, you know?
I really like the idea of having this as a form.
Yeah. Well, I am really into systems. Just, I think from being a classroom teacher, I can see how well they serve us. And this is an example of a system. And I've also used this for mediation successfully, where the people in the mediation, before they come to the mediation, they fill out this form. And they can bring it to the mediation to use as a guide for speaking. And that's worked out really well.
I have a question from first from Mabel and then from Iboya.
So
Go ahead, Mabel.
I was curious, do you have any examples of where this was used with the group? Because your bubbles talk about perhaps feedback to a committee or whatever.
Yes, somebody used a feedback form for her cook team. And she wanted the cook team to know how stressful it was for her to have to pace herself on that team. And they really received it well, you know, they ended up it really impacted how her tasks were delineated and just, you know, how she was treated. I don't remember the details, but that was an example to a group.
So did the group also fill out a form?
No, they didn't need to.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, question from Iboya.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was fantastic. I have three questions. The first is, how long have you lived in a community? Whether you lived in a community or several. And then during those years that you lived in community, have you seen members so disappointed, so conflicted, so not able to resolve the conflicts that they eventually moved out? And how many, if you've seen?
Okay, so this community has been around for moving into like 25 years or something like that, close to that, maybe not quite that long. And I came in 5 years into the community. I've lived in 3 different houses in the community just because of the way my life worked. You know, I split up and kids grew up and things like that. Yeah, people have left. We just had a family leave last year. And they were always, you know, in conflict about living here. I think from the beginning, it was challenging for them. And another family left many years ago, a couple. And oh, and there was a family that left because they were vegetarians and we were getting goats at the time. No, we were getting pigs. And then we were slaughtering the pigs. So that was tough. But they left very respectfully. And there's not that many people leave because they don't like it, you know, out of conflict. Most people leave, you know, because of divorce or having to get another job or, you know, moving, you know, things like that. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for also stating the reasons, because that would have been my last question. But what are some of the common reasons, you know, that prompt people to not be able to stay with the community?
Yeah. We have had a few deaths, you know, even though it's, you know, we've been around a long time, and you know, when the community first started, there was, you know, everybody was young with little kids or pregnant, you know, and now we're faced with being a little mono-aged, and that's a big thing. I was gonna say something. I can't remember.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, so my last slide is about my book, and it's because, you know, it's another systems approach. This book that I wrote for parents and teachers are 3 systems for staying connected. And like my feedback form and my empathy chart, I've had a lot of effectiveness creating these systems and using them. And you know, originally I was actually going to do a talk about kids in co-housing, you know, growing up in co-housing for this conference. But in talking to Marie, we ended up changing it because A, Rocky Corner doesn't have kids, and B, I had expertise in other areas. So, but anyway, I was going to come to the conference with all these physical books because I've got all these boxes behind me right now that I'm not using. But anyway, you can, if you're interested, or if you know somebody who's interested in conflict in families or in classrooms, you can go to my website, which is right at the bottom. It has a little short and sweet video of co-housing kids. We made the video here. Well, actually, the co-housing kids made it in my classroom, but and get an idea of what the coho kids are like. And that's all I got.
Any questions? Shall I unmute everybody? Do popcorn questions or? Oh.
Or you could use this opportunity to give me feedback.
Ah. There is a feedback form on the program.
Okay.
I have a combination of both. This is Neil. Actually, the thing that really warms my heart the most is that this work needs to get into, somebody mentioned it earlier, the DNA of forming communities. It's just critical, essential, you know, a standard. I think I called it earlier in the chat. I just feel like it's just critical, and I want to be able to help you get the word out to a larger audience should you be interested in doing that.
Oh yeah, definitely, most definitely. Thank you.
Marie's got a question. Who's got her hand up?
So Rocky Corner has taken about 12 years or longer to develop. And I would say, we started Sociocracy in 2012, and I would say the circle that's had the most difficulty is the one we call community relations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the scariest one, and I think for people to wrap their heads around, and I think a lack of knowledge or education that most of us, we just don't get it. I wish I had been in your first grade class, Gina, because I think I would have grown up, you know, knowing how to communicate my needs better and probably be more accepting of hearing what other people's needs are. So our group presently is studying nonviolent communication together. Mm. But I did have a conflict with one of our members, and we did ask for a mediation, and it actually went really well, because I think the other person and I really trusted the two people who were sitting with us and listening, and it felt like a safe place and a place that we could both talk freely, and we finally realized what the conflict was, which, I mean, we were making assumptions about each other, which is what was happening. Mm-hmm. So is that, do you think, do you have other resources besides learning nonviolent communication that you would suggest to a forming community to just get in the works right away, or to use for the community members to educate themselves?
Yeah, well, our little booklet, which I don't know if you have access to, we call it the Heal, Grow, and Connect. We have this little symbol with all these three little beautiful areas. And it just, like I was describing, it has a lot of options for people. You know, one of the things that would help, I think, is some training in restorative circles. And restorative circles are good because they were invented by this man named Dominic Barter from, he's British, but he lives in Brazil, and he's an NVC person who created this format for communities, basically. It's conflict in communities. And the premise is that any conflict within a community has a ripple effect, and it affects the whole community. So, you know, so we've had a few restorative circles too. So that's another more labor intensive for a care and counsel type circle to put together, because There's so many people involved. So let's say, like we had one that was based on how somebody's addition was built. They didn't like how their addition was built. And their addition was built by somebody who lived in the community. And this person had done other building projects in the community too. So you can see how that would have rippled. And so we first met, I co-facilitated this. We first met with the people who we call the author of the problem. Those, it was a couple. And we met with them, and then we asked each of them who else they wanted to invite to the circle that could have been impacted. So of course the builder, and then we asked the builder, you know, well, my wife was actually impacted. It keeps going. We ended up having a pretty big circle of people in a room. And there's a whole format for doing that. And the most powerful element in a restorative circle is the reflective listening aspect of it. And I use reflective listening also in mediations, but it's just basically, if I'm speaking and I'm saying, you know, I really experienced a sarcastic voice when we were in that meeting, and, you know, blah, 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 then I'm asked by the facilitator who I would like in the room, could be anybody, not just the person who uses sarcastic voice, but it could be anybody in the room, to reflect back what I just said, but not parrot back what I said, but to get the essence out of what I just said. So they might say something like I might pick, you know, my husband to reflect back, you know, and he might say, well, I think Gina just really needs to have a predictable amount of respect in the room, you know, something like that. So it's, you can imagine, you know, the power of that. Like now another person is saying what I said, but in their words. And anyway, it's got a lot of really powerful potential for healing. And then also you're supposed to get back together with that group at some point in the future to talk about how things are going, but we have never succeeded in that. All the restorative circles we've done over time. Because, you know, they just heal, and so it's just like nobody needs to talk about this anymore. Scheduling a lot of people is challenging. So yeah, that's another thing to have in your toolkit. And if you want access to our Care and Counsel booklet, I can send that to you.
Yeah, I think we've found it.
Yeah.
Your website, but it had, you know, it mentions a lot of different things that people can choose from, but somebody has to learn how to manage those things or mediate those things. You know, there's exactly. A lot of education for that circle.
Yeah, I would say, you know, how to do a listening ear, which now everybody in this group knows how to do. How to do a facilitated conversation, how to do a mediation, and how to do a restorative circle. I would say those 4 things.
Great, thank you.
And we've used Byron Katie sheets with a few people, and that was really good. You have to, you know, understand how she, you know, a lot of people know about her.
I'm sorry, what? You used what?
Oh, yes. Okay. So there's this person named Byron Katie, which is sort of backwards for Katie Byron. And she turned her name around because one of her things that she likes to do is something called turnarounds. So if I say, you know, he's so unhealthy, how can I turn that around? One way I can turn it around is by saying, he's so healthy. Think about that. Maybe think about it as him being healthy. He's got a healthy attitude about not being healthy. You know what I mean? Another way to turn it around is, I'm so unhealthy. Does that ring true? Well, yeah, that's why I'm criticizing him. So, you know, there's all these ways you turn things around, and it's a format, and it's a sheet that you do. So that's a system, Byron Katie. And we've had some Byron Katie trainings in our community from people who know how to do that.
We have 5 minutes before for any last questions.
Wow. I timed my talk yesterday and it was only 40 minutes without the questions. So this is good.
I can also say that the break is going to start right at 10 minutes of, and if everybody wants to go over to the breakout room and go into group breakout rooms at the ballroom. Roger has a question.
Yeah, hi, Gina, thanks so much for this. It's been really interesting and useful. Can you talk at all about how the underlying values of sociocracy and feed into this, and how we can emphasize those as we teach sociocracy to ourselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, Ted is in the room and he can answer it too, but I'll just say it's so provides an opportunity for everybody to have a voice. It's completely predictable and it's systematic. And, you know, Ted and I both wrote our books together in cafes when you used to be able to go to a cafe and write a book together. And we talked about systems all the time. And so just like that example that I used of knowing that it's going to be my turn to talk is huge. That's called rounds. Another thing is that the selection process is such a, it's such a uplifting format for people, because when you select somebody to be the new leader or the new facilitator, etc., all the different roles, you're giving reasons why you selected that person. And whether they get selected or not, that person gets to hear what you appreciate about them. So those are just two things off the top. But Ted, why don't you just say he's so good at, you know, like coming up with one sentence.
Well, I think I actually have been thinking about this a little because I recently wrote my thoughts about nonviolent communication and sociocracy and how they go together, wrote them down, and I can share that in a moment. And I've really come to the conclusion that sociocracy can't be done without conflict resolution and some good communication skill, right? And vice versa. So I would really put those two together, because if you only have conflict resolution, or, you know, like only, and I mean that in quotes, only a way, as if it were a small thing of talking, you know, in a good way with each other, which is already a tall order, then you're still not going to have forward motion, right? So it's really the balance of how we're good in the moment, but we're also going somewhere. So those two really need to go together. Otherwise, the need for forward motion and for, you know, whatever people are actually there in the meeting for is not going to get done. That's also a need that needs to be taken seriously. So balance, balance, balance.
Thank you, Gina, very much for this talk. This was very informative.
Yeah.